Before sunrise, the cafe on Alder Street glowed like a lantern against the gray sweep of Lake Michigan. A thin mist drifted along the sidewalk, clinging to the streetlights and softening the sharp edges of the city. Inside, warmth gathered in layers, the steady hum of the espresso machine, the golden pools of light above each table, the scent of roasted beans blooming in the air. The shop was smaller than the flagship stores downtown, humbler too, with worn oak floors and brick walls that carried the memory of decades. A woman in a simple wool coat stepped through the door, pausing just long enough to take it all in. No one looked twice at her. To them, she was only another early customer seeking heat against the cold morning. But beneath the knitted cap and muted scarf stood Clara Bennett, founder and CEO of Bennett Brew Company, the name etched in graceful lettering across every cup stacked behind the counter. She had built an empire on efficiency and consistency. Today, she came alone and unannounced, curious about what her empire looked like without her presence shaping it. Clara chose a corner seat by the window where she could see both the counter and the door. She placed her leather gloves neatly on the table and wrapped her hands around the menu as if studying it, though she already knew every item by heart. The jazz drifting from hidden speakers was soft and mellow, the kind curated to encourage longer stays and second refills. Behind the counter stood a tall barista with thoughtful eyes and a quiet steadiness in his movements. His name tag read Isaiah Cole. He greeted each customer not with rehearsed cheerfulness, but with something warmer, something grounded. "Morning, Ms. Alvarez," he said to an older woman who shuffled in with a cane. "The usual?" She nodded, smiling as if she had just been given a small gift. When Clara's turn came, Isaiah approached her with that same calm presence. "Good morning," he said. "What can I get started for you?" She ordered a simple black coffee, curious to taste it without the distractions of syrups or foam. As he poured, steam curled upward in delicate ribbons. He placed the cup before her gently, as though setting down something fragile. But instead of stepping away, he hesitated, studying her face with a kind of respectful curiosity. "Ma'am," he asked softly, "can I ask you something?" Clara looked up, mildly surprised. She was used to being the one who asked questions. "If someone couldn't afford a cup of coffee," he continued, "what would you do?" The question was so unexpected that she almost laughed. It sounded like a riddle or a social experiment. "I suppose," she answered after a pause, her tone even and controlled, "I wouldn't sell it. Businesses can't survive on good intentions alone." She expected either agreement or awkward silence. Instead, Isaiah nodded slowly, as if he had anticipated that response. "I understand," he said. "But here, we'd pour it anyway. Everyone deserves warmth." His voice was neither defensive nor proud. It was simply certain. The words lingered in the air between them, mixing with the scent of coffee and cinnamon. Clara felt something shift inside her, a subtle tightening beneath her ribs. She lowered her eyes to the dark surface of her drink, unsettled by the ease with which he had spoken. She told herself it was naive idealism. Generosity sounded noble until it appeared on a quarterly law statement. She had spent years tightening operational standards, minimizing waste, enforcing strict policies against unauthorized discounts. Shrinkage, no matter how small, multiplied across hundreds of stores. $1 here, $2 there. It became thousands by the end of the year. Yet, as she lifted the cup to her lips, the coffee tasted fuller than she expected, rich and layered. She watched Isaiah move back into the rhythm of the cafe, laughing softly with a college student, steadying a tray for a man juggling a briefcase and phone. Nothing about him seemed reckless or careless. There was discipline in his movements, intention in his smile. A frail man entered then, his coat too thin for the biting wind outside. He approached the counter slowly, counting coins in his palm. Clara saw Isaiah's expression soften, saw him lean forward to listen. Though she couldn't hear their entire exchange, she saw the hesitation, the quiet nod, the gentle slide of a steaming cup across the counter. She noticed Isaiah reach into his tip jar and discreetly add a coin to the register. No announcement, no display of charity, just a seamless act folded into the routine of service. The man's shoulders relaxed as he carried the cup to a table near the heater. Clara's phone buzzed in her coat pocket, a reminder about the upcoming board meeting. Agenda: cost control measures, regional audits, labor efficiency metrics. She silenced it without looking. Her gaze remained fixed on Isaiah as he wiped the counter, humming softly under his breath. The cafe felt alive in a way her polished headquarters never did. Here, warmth wasn't just a marketing slogan printed on seasonal cups. It was something practiced, quiet, and unrecorded. She realized with a flicker of discomfort that nowhere in her policy manuals did it mention what to do when someone simply needed kindness. Outside, the mist thickened, blurring the skyline. Inside, light pooled warmly over brick and wood. Clara took another slow sip of her coffee, feeling smaller than she had in years. She had come to observe compliance, to measure performance against corporate standards. Instead, she found herself questioning the very standards she had created. Isaiah's words echoed in her mind, gentle but unyielding. Everyone deserves warmth. For the first time since building Bennett Brew into a national brand, Clara wondered whether success measured in margins alone had quietly stripped something essential from the company's soul. The following morning arrived wrapped in a steel gray sky, the wind sweeping off Lake Michigan with a sharper bite. Clara returned before the rush, determined to watch more closely, to understand whether what she had witnessed the day before was an exception or a quiet pattern. She dressed even more simply this time, faded jeans, a long charcoal coat, no jewelry that might betray her status. When she stepped inside Bennett Brew, the familiar warmth met her again, but beneath it she sensed a fragile tension, like a violin string pulled too tight. Isaiah was already behind the counter, sleeves rolled neatly, moving with his usual steady rhythm. Beside him stood an older cashier whose name tag read Marlene. Her silver hair was pinned back loosely, and her hands trembled slightly as she arranged bills in the register. Clara noticed the nervous glances Marlene cast toward the door every few minutes, as though expecting something unpleasant to walk through it. It did. At precisely 8:47 a.m., the bell above the entrance chimed sharply, and a tall man in a tailored navy coat strode inside. His polished shoes struck the wooden floor with a deliberate click. This was Richard Hale, Regional Operations Manager. Clara knew him well. She had promoted him herself 2 years ago after he presented an aggressive profit recovery strategy that impressed the board. He had a talent for trimming inefficiencies, for identifying leaks in systems. He also possessed a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Richard didn't greet anyone. Instead, he scanned the cafe as if inspecting a warehouse. "Morning," he said curtly, dropping a black leather folder onto the counter. Marlene straightened immediately. "Good morning, sir," she murmured. Isaiah offered a polite nod. Richard ignored it. "Let's hope yesterday's drawer balanced," Richard said, flipping open his folder. "Corporate flagged 3 consecutive shortages from this location. That's not a coincidence." Marlene swallowed. "I double-checked the numbers, Mr. Hale. It should be accurate now." He gave a humorless laugh. "Should be isn't good enough." His gaze shifted to Isaiah. "And you, try focusing less on storytelling and more on transactions. We're not running a charity house." The words were sharp, but what unsettled Clara more was the implication beneath them. The subtle narrowing of Richard's eyes when he looked at Isaiah, as if assessing him for something beyond job performance. Isaiah didn't rise to the bait. "All transactions are logged, sir," he replied evenly. "You're welcome to review them." Richard opened the register himself, counting bills with exaggerated precision. Customers waiting in line exchanged uncomfortable glances. The atmosphere changed. The soft jazz felt misplaced now, almost ironic. "Short again," Richard announced after a moment. $2.12. "Funny how that keeps happening." Marlene's face drained of color. "It must be a miscount," she said quickly. Richard leaned closer across the counter. "Or maybe someone thinks policy doesn't apply here." His eyes flicked toward Isaiah again. "Generosity is admirable on your own time, not mine." Clara felt heat rise in her chest. She remembered the boardroom presentation where Richard had spoken about eliminating sentiment-driven losses. At the time, she had nodded in agreement. Now, hearing the phrase echoed in his tone, it sounded colder than she had intended. A man in a worn army jacket entered quietly, shaking rain from his sleeves. Clara recognized him from the day before. He approached the counter with cautious steps. "Morning," he said softly. "Got about $1.80 today." Marlene froze. Richard turned slowly, observing the exchange with thinly veiled disdain. Isaiah met the veteran's eyes and smiled gently. "We'll take care of you," he said. Richard's jaw tightened. "No," he cut in sharply. "We won't. Price is listed. $2.50. The veteran hesitated, embarrassment flushing his face. "I can come back," he muttered. Isaiah reached subtly toward the tip jar. Richard's hand slammed down on the counter. "Don't," he warned. The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara's fingers curled around her cup. Isaiah's expression didn't harden. If anything, it softened. "Sir," he said calmly, "it's covered." He placed $1 from his own wallet into the register, then handed the veteran the coffee. The man nodded in quiet gratitude and moved to a corner table. Richard stared at the register, then at Isaiah. "Document that as personal compensation," he said coldly. "And understand this. Any further discrepancies will result in suspension pending investigation." Marlene's hand shook so badly she nearly dropped the receipt pad. Customers avoided eye contact, pretending sudden fascination with their phones. Clara felt something shift again, stronger this time. The policies she had written were meant to protect the company from exploitation, not to strip it of humanity. Yet here stood a manager wielding them like a weapon. She watched Isaiah return to wiping the counter, his shoulders straight despite the tension pressing against him. There was no defiance in his posture, only quiet conviction. Marlene leaned toward him and whispered something Clara couldn't hear, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. Isaiah offered her a reassuring nod. Richard snapped his folder shut. "Fix it," he said, before turning toward the door. "Or I will." The bell clanged harshly as he exited. Gradually, conversation resumed, though softer than before. Clara remained seated, her untouched coffee cooling in her hands. For the first time since founding Bennett Brew, she wondered whether her pursuit of flawless margins had empowered the wrong kind of leadership. Across the room, Isaiah laughed gently at something a customer said, as if the tension had never existed. But Clara could still feel it lingering in the air, a question not about money, but about what her company truly stood for. Rain fell steadily on the third morning, tracing thin silver lines down the cafe windows and blurring the view of passing cars. The city looked washed out, subdued, as though holding its breath. Clara stood across the street for a long moment before going in, watching the soft glow from inside spill onto the wet pavement. She had barely slept. Spreadsheets and balance reports had haunted her the night before, numbers that once gave her satisfaction now appearing hollow and strangely disconnected from the scenes replaying in her mind. Isaiah's steady gaze, Marlene's trembling hands, Richard's clipped, merciless tone. When she finally pushed open the door, the bell chimed faintly, and warmth folded around her once more. Inside, the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. Conversations were muted, movements more careful. Isaiah was preparing a fresh batch of drip coffee, his motions precise but quieter than before. Marlene stood at the register, shoulders slightly hunched, double-checking the cash drawer with visible anxiety. Clara noticed faint shadows under her eyes. The older woman looked like someone bracing for impact. Clara took her usual seat by the window, though this time she didn't pretend to scroll through her phone. She simply watched. At exactly 9:15, Richard Hale entered again, rain clinging to the shoulders of his coat. He didn't remove it immediately, as though intending to leave quickly after delivering whatever blow he had prepared. "Ledger," he said without greeting. Marlene handed it over, her fingers unsteady. Richard flipped through the pages with brisk impatience. The cafe had grown so quiet that the turning of paper sounded unnaturally loud. Clara's pulse quickened as she noticed a crisp white envelope tucked inside his folder, stamped with the company's official insignia. "Well," Richard said finally, closing the ledger with a decisive snap. 3 shortages this week. $2, then $1.75, now $1.50. Consistent pattern. He removed the envelope and tapped it against the counter. Corporate has zero tolerance for repeated cash loss. The word corporate landed heavily in Clara's ears. She knew that voice. It was the voice she had trained her managers to use, the tone of authority polished to intimidate. Marlene's lips parted, but no sound came out at first. "Sir, we can explain," she began. Richard cut her off. "I'm not interested in explanations. I'm interested in accountability." Isaiah stepped forward before Marlene could say more. His voice was calm, measured. "If there's accountability needed, it's mine." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You're admitting responsibility?" "Yes," Isaiah replied. "The shortages were from drinks I covered personally." A murmur rippled through the few customers seated nearby. Clara felt her chest tighten. Richard's expression hardened into something almost triumphant. "So you acknowledge violating company policy regarding unauthorized complimentary items?" Isaiah didn't flinch. "I acknowledge choosing compassion when someone couldn't afford warmth." The sentence hung in the air, clear and unashamed. Clara felt it like a mirror held directly in front of her. Richard slid the envelope across the counter. "Then this is straightforward. Suspension pending formal review. Effective immediately." Marlene gasped softly. "No," she whispered. "He didn't do anything wrong." Richard ignored her. "Sign here," he instructed Isaiah, placing a pen on top of the envelope. Isaiah glanced at Marlene, offering her a small, reassuring smile, as though he were the one comforting her. "It's all right," he said gently. "I stand by what I did." Clara's hands curled into fists beneath the table. She could see the cost of that quiet bravery, not just a job, but stability, health insurance, dignity. She remembered her father's early lessons when Bennett Brew was only a single neighborhood shop. People first, always. Somewhere along the path to expansion and investor meetings, she had replaced that principle with bullet point policies and loss prevention metrics. And now those very policies were being used to silence the spirit that once defined her brand. Richard leaned closer to Isaiah, lowering his voice, but not enough to avoid being overheard. "Kindness doesn't pay rent," he said coldly. "Structure does." Isaiah met his gaze steadily. "Sometimes kindness is the structure," he replied. The simplicity of that answer made Clara's breath catch. Around them, customers shifted uncomfortably, sensing something larger unfolding. The rain tapped insistently against the glass, as if urging movement, urging decision. Marlene's hands were shaking openly now. "Please," she said, looking between the two men. "There has to be another way." Richard straightened, clearly finished. The decision's made. He pushed the envelope closer to Isaiah. For a suspended second, no one moved. Clara felt the weight of her own silence pressing down on her. She had come to observe, to gather information before intervening. But observation had turned into complicity. Across the room, Isaiah reached for the pen, not angrily, not defeated, simply resolved. And in that moment, as the tip of the pen hovered above the paper, Clara understood that the true shortage in her company was not dollars missing from a drawer. It was courage missing from leadership. The pen never touched the paper. Before Isaiah could sign, the sharp sound of a chair scraping against the floor cut through the silence. Clara rose slowly from her corner table, removing her knitted cap with deliberate calm. The movement drew every eye in the room. Rain tapped steadily against the windows, but inside the cafe the air felt suspended, charged. She stepped forward, heels steady against the wood floor, and stopped at the counter between Isaiah and Richard. For a moment, Richard looked irritated at the interruption. Then recognition dawned. The color drained from his face. "Ms. Bennett?" he stammered, straightening abruptly. Marlene's mouth fell open. Isaiah simply watched her, confusion flickering briefly across his expression. "Yes," Clara said evenly, her voice no longer disguised or softened. "Clara Bennett." She let the name settle in the space, watching it ripple through the room. Customers whispered. Richard recovered quickly, forcing a brittle smile. "I wasn't informed you'd be visiting this location," he said. "This is actually perfect timing. I was just addressing an ongoing loss issue." He tapped the envelope as though presenting evidence. Clara glanced down at it, then back at Isaiah. $1.50, she said quietly. "That's the loss." Richard cleared his throat. Repeated losses, technically. Patterns matter. Clara nodded once. They do. She turned slightly, facing the cafe. The worn brick, the steaming cups, the veteran still seated by the window, clutching his coffee like something precious. For 3 days, she began, her voice calm but resonant. I've sat in that corner and watched this store operate. I've seen professionalism. I've seen dignity. I've seen kindness handled with more care than any balance sheet I've reviewed this quarter. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Kindness doesn't negate policy, he insisted. Policy exists for a reason. Clara met his gaze. And leadership exists for a purpose. If policy crushes the very spirit that built this company, then the policy is flawed. The room was utterly silent now. Even the espresso machine seemed to pause between breaths. Clara picked up the envelope and tore it cleanly in half. The sound was soft but final. There will be no suspension, she said. Richard's composure cracked. With respect, Ms. Bennett, if we allow employees to ignore procedure, we risk systemic loss. Multiply small shortages across locations, and you're looking at thousands. Clara nodded again, acknowledging the arithmetic. And multiply fear across locations, she replied, and you're looking at something far more expensive. She turned to Marlene. You will not rewrite reports to disguise compassion, ever. Tears welled instantly in the older woman's eyes. Finally, Clara faced Isaiah. You asked me a question my first morning here, she said. What I would do if someone couldn't afford a cup of coffee. A faint understanding dawned in his expression. I gave you the wrong answer. She inhaled slowly. Effective immediately, Bennett Brew will implement a community cup initiative. Each store may allocate a modest daily budget for complimentary drinks, transparent, documented, and protected. No employee will be penalized for using it within guidelines. Murmurs of relief and surprise spread among the customers. Richard opened his mouth to object, but Clara raised a hand. Additionally, she continued, we will review management conduct across all Chicago locations. Respect is not optional in this company. Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He understood what the measured tone implied. Clara stepped back slightly, allowing the tension to dissolve. The veteran by the window lifted his cup subtly in gratitude. Marlene wiped her cheeks. Her posture straighter than Clara had seen all week. Isaiah regarded her quietly. Everyone deserves warmth, he said again, not triumphantly, just as a reminder. Clara allowed herself a small smile. Yes, she agreed. They do, including the people who work for me. Outside, the rain began to lighten, thinning into mist. Sunlight pushed faintly through the clouds, catching on the cafe sign and making the gold lettering gleam. Inside, conversation slowly resumed, softer but freer. Clara remained for a while longer, not as a hidden observer this time, but as part of the room. For the first time in years, the numbers waiting on her desk did not feel like the only measure of success. The true balance she needed to restore was not in the register. It was in the space between profit and humanity. And at last, she understood how easily one cup of coffee could tip the scale.